Welcome back to Occult Archives.
Yeah.
If you're new around these parts, we love to crack open history's most talked about, and let's be honest, sometimes feared books.
Right.
We've covered so many of those whispered about grimoires to the, just the weighty tomes of ancient wisdom.
Yeah.
Those books that have captivated so many readers, and honestly, for some, they've been a bit unsettling across the ages.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'm your host, ready to kind of jump into the heart of another one.
And I'm here to lend a little bit of context, hopefully some clarity as we make our way through the sometimes
Oh, yeah.
intriguing terrain that these books
Yeah.
review.
And, speaking of intriguing terrain today, we're taking a deep dive into Manly P. Hall's Initiates of the Flame, the Hidden Brotherhood of Light. Now, if you know Hall,
Right, sure.
he's a fascinating guy, and this book was published way back in 1922,
Wow.
and it really promises to unearth the secrets of a spiritual elite, a hidden group that has been dedicated to safeguarding a vital inner fire within humanity.
Right.
So think of this as a shortcut to understanding some of these big, complex
Yeah.
ideas.
Okay.
Our mission today is to really kind of get to the core concepts in Initiates of the Flame,
Right.
especially around this idea of a spiritual flame within us all.
Yeah.
And who are these guardians that have tended to it historically?
Yeah, exactly. Consider this our focused exploration.
Yeah.
This work can be a journey in itself.
Right.
And we're here to try to extract, the most significant insights,
Right.
especially around this idea of spiritual fire and its guardians.
Okay, well, let's ignite our exploration right at the beginning with the first chapter, which is titled The Fire Upon the Altar.
Nice.
I like that title. Right off the bat, he introduces this really strong image of a flame burning on what he calls the altar of humanity.
Yeah.
It's a pretty striking metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think what's key to grasp right away is just the proposition that Hall's making here. Just as ancient priests tended sacred fires in temples,
Mm.
he suggests that there are certain souls, even now acting as guardians of this fundamental spiritual principle,
Right.
in humankind. And this flame is often obscure, hidden beneath the ruins of man's fallen temple,
Right.
which I think we can look at as the distractions of our modern world overshadowing our deeper spiritual nature.
Yeah, and it gets even bigger than that because he connects this flame directly to the destinies of entire nations.
Oh, wow.
He brings up Greece and Rome and Egypt and suggests that this weakening of this inner light was a critical factor in their decline. So he has a really cyclical view of history,
Right.
almost as if the spiritual fire shifts to new peoples when a civilization loses its way. So it's not just about individual spirituality, it's about the spiritual health
Yeah, for
of
sure.
a societies as a whole.
And the bigger picture here,
Mm.
he's not talking about literal bonfires.
Mhm.
He's talking about, the flame is a symbol for a vital spiritual energy, a connection to something greater than ourselves.
Right.
And I think the idea that when this inner light dims, a civilization loses its vital force and eventually collapses is something powerful to consider.
Right.
He even goes on to point out that those who once revered this flame are now called heathens,
Right.
a term loaded with negative meaning.
Mm.
But he reinterprets this by suggesting that true spiritual awakening
Right.
is akin to being baptized with the Holy Spirit, which is
Yeah.
fire. So in this context, fire is not destructive,
Yeah.
but purifying.
It's about light.
Yeah, purifying spiritual light.
Yeah, which brings us directly to the Initiates of the Flame.
Right.
That's in the title.
Yeah.
And he describes them as individuals who've, strived to ignite and nurture the spark within themselves and crucially within others throughout history.
Yeah.
It's almost like this hidden lineage of spiritual torchbearers.
What I find fascinating is the universality that he kind of attributes to this lineage.
Right.
He brings up a pretty remarkable list of historical and religious figures.
Yeah.
Orpheus, Hermes, Krishna, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Zoroaster, Confucius, Odin, Moses.
It's a pretty diverse group.
Yeah, and he's identifying them all as sons of flame,
Sons of Flame. Yeah.
united by a single underlying ideal,
Hmm.
despite the diverse creeds that, kind of formed around them later.
So many different cultures and eras represented there.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about a possible common thread.
Right. And he goes on to say that there's but one religion in all the world, the
Right.
worship of God, the spiritual flame of the universe,
Right.
just expressed in different ways. Iswari Aman God, all these names pointing to this ultimate reality with fire as its core shared symbol.
Right. And I think if we can kind of connect this to a broader understanding,
Yeah.
He's hinting at what's often called a perennial philosophy.
Right.
This idea of a core spiritual truth that underlies all religious expressions.
Right.
And then he goes into, humanity's role in this, describing us as flame-born sons of God who have, in a sense, built forms our bodies that have obscured our inner light.
Right.
And the path of learning and growth, according to Hall, involves increasing this light through dedicated study, genuine love, and selfless service.
So then he introduces this image of the cube altar.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that shape and its connection to the flame?
The cube altar is a symbol with many layers. The cube itself often represents the elements of the earth, and by extension, the human body.
Right.
Our physical form, constructed from material elements,
Right.
the flame burning upon or within this altar is the spiritual essence, the spirit of all created things.
Okay.
So he's saying that we ourselves and our physical being are the altar.
Wow.
Upon which this spiritual fire resides. So it's a very personal and embodied spirituality that he's outlining.
And fire, of course, has played such a prominent role in religious ceremony.
That's for sure.
Throughout history, he talks about Zoroastrianism, the ancient Israelites, the altar of burnt offerings.
Yeah.
It seems like it's a recurring motif across so many cultures and times. Why do you think fire holds such a central place?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is how he connects these outward rituals
Right.
to an inner personal reality.
Okay.
We find the ever-burning lamp in many ancient traditions,
Right.
and it's not just a physical lamp that needs oil. It's a symbol of the spiritual flame within each of us that needs its own kind of nourishment.
Right.
And just as those ancient lamps required pure oil to keep burning steadily, our inner fire needs to be fueled by, a life of purity and altruistic actions.
So then he talks about these two paths of humanity.
Right.
The sons of Seth associated with faith, heart, and water, and then the children of Cain linked to the mind, action, and fire.
Right.
With groups like alchemists and Hermetic philosophers and Rosicrucians and Freemasons aligning with the children of Cain.
Right.
It's an interesting way to kind of categorize these different spiritual approaches.
It is. And I think it kind of highlights, different temperaments, different ways of engaging with the process of spiritual development.
Right.
However, I think it's important to, see that Hall's not necessarily presenting them in opposition,
Right.
but rather as different facets of the human experience,
Right.
and different ways of kind of interacting with that inner spiritual flame.
Right.
And then he brings it back to the individual as a cube altar,
Right.
where the initiate consciously and actively nourishes
Right.
this inner spiritual flame. And he draws a direct parallel to the Vestal Virgins,
Okay.
who were responsible for safeguarding the sacred temple fires.
And this ever-burning lamp of the alchemist that's sometimes found in catacombs,
Yeah.
Hall interprets that not just as an old artifact, but as a potent symbol of this inner fire and the way that it's sustained.
Right.
And he even connects it to our physical form, specifically the spinal column and this image of a little blue and red flame at the very top.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty vivid connection between the physical and spiritual.
What's fascinating here is this kind of integration of what you might call esoteric anatomy.
Right.
He's linking the physical structure of the spine
Right.
to this concept of inner spiritual energy, almost suggesting a pathway for these vital life essences to be purified and directed upwards
Okay.
to fuel that ever-burning lamp within our own being.
He also talks about the Masonic censer.
Yeah.
That vessel used for burning incense as a symbol of the individual's spiritual growth and development. And that rising fragrant smoke becomes an analogy for the transmutation of our more base qualities
Right.
into something refined
Right.
and offered to the divine through this inner spiritual flame. So it's almost like our imperfections being turned into something sacred.
Yeah, exactly. It's a process of inner alchemy,
Right.
where our flaws and our lower tendencies are gradually purified and transformed by that internal spiritual fire.
Right.
Even the animal sacrifices described in the Bible,
Yeah.
like the offering of the ram or the bull.
Yeah.
He reinterprets these symbolically as, representing the offering of our lower, more instinctual animal nature upon the altar of our higher self.
Right.
He even draws connections between, these animals and their corresponding zodiacal qualities,
Interesting.
suggesting a deeper symbolic language at play.
Then he moves on to the Masonic symbol of mortality.
Yeah.
The spade, the coffin, the open grave, the sprig of acacia.
Right.
And finds deeper meaning in each of these seemingly stark elements.
Right.
The spade, for instance, he connects to the spinal column, and even the spade shape on playing cards to the sacrum bone,
Right.
the very base of the spine.
Yeah.
and a significant center for life energy. So it's quite an intricate web of symbolism he's weaving.
Yeah, it is. And I think, he sees multiple layers of meaning embedded in these symbols,
Right.
suggesting that even something like a playing card,
Right.
might hold esoteric significance.
Hmm.
And I think the key takeaway here is just his continued emphasis on transmuting those lower spinal nerve forces upwards to nourish the altar fire,
Okay.
located at the upper end of the spine, which he associates with higher consciousness and spiritual awareness.
And he makes this point about where we focus our thoughts and emotions.
Right.
And that ultimately determines how our life energy is expended.
Sure, sure.
And he suggests that living with altruistic intentions allows these lower forces to actually fuel the ever-burning lamp within us.
Right.
So it's a call for a very conscious use of our
Oh, yeah.
inner energies.
It's about intentionally directing our energy towards, higher pursuits and noble intentions rather than allowing it to be consumed by more base desires and impulses.
And that familiar image of the candle hidden under the bushel
Yeah.
then takes on new meaning as a metaphor for our own inner light.
Right.
That inherent potential that we have to dispel ignorance and bring clarity, but one that requires a purified body and a balanced mind for that light to shine. For sure.
Without obstruction.
Right.
He even broadens this to the cosmos.
Yeah.
And describes this spiritual sun that he sees existing behind the physical sun as this greater flame that itself grew through processes of attraction and transmutation, mirroring that light that shineth in darkness within each of us. So it's this
Right.
kind of cosmic echo.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is his use of this microcosm analogy.
Right.
He sees a direct parallel between the grand development of the cosmos and the unfolding of consciousness within the individual.
Okay.
This inner light, he says, is the very essence of what he calls the lamp of the philosopher.
Right.
This guiding light that leads us through the darkness of ignorance and has the potential to reveal, hidden aspects and deeper truths of reality.
And the chapter comes to a close with this really powerful call to inward action,
Right.
urging each of us to watch the fire on our own altar, our physical bodies,
Right.
to actively purify it, to consciously sacrifice our actions and our deeds upon it, and ultimately to dispel those symbols of mortality.
By mastering our lower emotions.
Okay.
The goal is to rekindle that altar flame, not just for ourselves, but as a service to the living God.
Yeah.
So it's a very personal and transformative message he leaves us with.
Yeah, it really sets the foundational ideas for the rest of the book,
Right.
emphasizing this sense of personal responsibility in cultivating and tending to our own inner spiritual fire.
Moving into chapter 2, we encounter the sacred city of Shambhala.
Yeah.
Now, this sounds like something straight out of the realm of myth and ancient legend.
Right.
What exactly is Shambhala in Hall's view?
It is steeped in myth, and I think he starts by pointing out that virtually every, major mythology and religion
Right.
features some kind of sacred, almost unattainable spot.
Right.
Places like Valhalla,
Yeah.
Mount Olympus, Mount Salvard,
Well, Mount Meru.
Mount Meru, Mount Moriah, Mount Sinai.
Right.
And he sees all of these as, symbolic representations
Right.
of a universal ideal,
Mm-hmm.
all culminating in this legendary city of Shambhala, which is traditionally said to be located in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia.
And what is the significance of Shambhala? What makes it so important in this spiritual landscape?
According to Hosmia, Shambhala is considered to be the meeting place
Right.
of the Great White Lodge, or Brotherhood, which he describes as a council of 12 highly evolved beings who are said to subtly govern the affairs of the world.
Wow.
Drawing parallels to figures like the ancient Asuras or the gods of Olympus.
So it's like a spiritual power center.
Yeah, a hub for, universal religious and spiritual guidance for humanity.
And while it sounds like a physical location, we should really think of it as that still centered place within us.
Yeah, for sure.
Where our highest wisdom resides.
Right,
He even delves into the Earth's physical history, mentioning the shifting of the polar cap,
right.
the various subtle motions of our planet, suggesting that Shambhala's current purported location in Mongolia
Yeah.
is a result of these, immense events over vast stretches of time.
It's interesting how he tries to ground this seemingly mythical city within a framework of cosmic and earthly processes.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
And then he connects, this longing for such a sacred place to the practice of pilgrimages across different religions,
Right.
whether it's the journey to the Kaaba at Mecca, the sacred sites in India, or even the Templars, the historical journeys to the sepulcher of Christ in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
He sees all of these as outward expressions of a deep inner spiritual quest.
And he interprets our own spiritual consciousness as being on a similar kind of pilgrimage,
Right.
an inner ascent through the energy centers and nerve pathways within our bodies.
Right.
Almost like climbing Mount Sinai or making that return journey to Mount Salvard.
Exactly.
It's a journey that's ultimately inward.
And he describes this upward movement of what he calls the spinal fire, pausing at various shrines or energy centers located within our being. Eventually passing through a metaphorical great desert, which he associates with periods of pain and suffering, before finally reaching the Golden City. Shambhala nestled within the heart of the lotus, which he identifies as the brain itself.
So the journey isn't external, it's a deeply
internal one.
internal journey. And the image of the lotus flower appears again.
Right.
And he explains it as this powerful symbol of consciousness gradually rising from the darkness of the more material world up towards the light of spiritual illumination represented by the sun. He even identifies the frontal sinus area of the brain as the seat of our divine essence, the lost city, that's connected by what he terms the rainbow bridge or the silver cord.
Yeah.
So it's very detailed and specific mapping of our...
He provides a very rich symbolic interpretation of the human body as a microcosm of the larger universe. With specific physical locations and structures corresponding to, profound spiritual principles. And then he goes into this concept of the rod that budded, which appears in various esoteric traditions.
Yeah.
And he explains this as representing the 7 key energy centers within us.
Right.
And these centers, as they develop, manifest spiritual powers and shine like centers of inner fire, often symbolized, in art and allegory as blooming flowers.
He really emphasizes this importance of being governed by our higher self, suggesting that allowing anything else to take the reins disrupts our inner harmony and spiritual attunement.
Right.
And he goes on to say that our inherent divine birthright is truly realized when the gods, which he sees as representing our own higher principles, are able to descend that rainbow bridge and impart their wisdom, bringing us knowledge of the arts and sciences.
And this really highlights that idea of inner guidance and the potential for our higher consciousness to directly inform and enrich our everyday earthly existence.
And he paints this picture of the Eastern spiritual student longing to undertake a pilgrimage, to worship at the very gates of Shambhala, to witness the assembly of the great initiates gathered around the symbolic zodiacal table, and to experience the profound unveilings of Isis and the sacred lifting of the Grail cup. So these are powerful images of spiritual aspiration.
But he's quick to point out that these profound experiences must first and foremost occur within the individual's own being.
Right.
Requiring a dedicated effort to reach and understand the 12 elder brothers who reside within us before we can even begin to comprehend those who exist on a universal scale.
Right.
This inner work also involves the crucial process of opening the lotus within ourselves through, dedicated purification of our thoughts and actions.
So the external seeking mirrors an internal journey.
Exactly.
Right.
And the outward symbols and legends are, in essence, reflections of our own inner potential for awakening and the personal journey of self-discovery that we must each undertake.
He then reiterates the symbol of the lotus, explaining its connection to the spinal column with its roots firmly planted in materiality and its blossom unfolding in the higher reaches of the brain, emphasizing the need for this upward nourishment of spiritual energy for it to truly bloom and release its fragrance.
For sure.
And these depictions of Oriental deities seated upon lotus blossoms, he explains, directly symbolizes the opening of this spiritual consciousness within the individual. Even something like the upside-down flower hats, sometimes worn by Hindu deities, are given this symbolic interpretation as another visual reference to this process of consciousness unfolding and blossoming within. It seems like Hall finds symbolic meaning in almost every detail.
Yeah, I think according to Hall's perspective, yes.
Yeah.
He sees this, remarkably consistent symbolic language woven throughout different cultures and spiritual traditions.
And he explains that, the lotus flower drops its seed, which gives rise to new plants, as mirroring the way in which our own spiritual consciousness, once its initial work is done, is released to go out and work and produce other things in the world.
Yeah.
So he draws this parallel connecting the well-known Western symbol of the rose, as seen in Rosicrucianism,
Right.
Freemasonry, and even the Order of the Garter to this same fundamental concept of the awakening of consciousness
Yeah.
and the gradual unfolding of the qualities of the soul. It's striking how these seemingly unrelated symbols kind of converge
Yeah.
on a similar idea.
It really reinforces this central theme of a universal underlying truth
Right.
that's expressed through a multitude of different cultural lenses and symbolic languages.
And he states that when this inner bud of consciousness finally opens within us, that's when we truly find Shambhala,
Yeah.
residing within our own being, much like finding gold pollen nestled within the heart of a flower.
He describes that profound sense of liberation that arises upon successfully accomplishing this inner pilgrimage
Yeah.
of spiritual fire, comparing it to the ascension of Christ.
Right.
He sees the fully realized spiritual human rising from their disciples, which he equates with the convolutions of the brain,
Okay.
with that powerful cry of the initiate consummatum est, meaning it is finished.
Right.
And understanding the true nature of Shambhala, he says, leads to joining the ranks of those who are depicted as wearing white robes of purity,
Right.
symbolizing their refined soul bodies and who dedicate themselves to guiding others along the path toward their own liberation and enlightenment.
It's a vision of spiritual attainment that leads to selfless service.
Right.
Finally, in this chapter, Hall introduces this enigmatic philosopher's stone.
Yeah.
Now, many might immediately think of alchemists trying to turn lead into gold, but Hall offers a different perspective, doesn't he?
He presents the philosopher's stone not as a literal stone,
Right.
with magical properties, but rather as the initiate themselves.
Right.
Someone who has been refined and polished by the myriad experiences of evolution and who now has the capacity to perfectly reflect
Right.
the radiant light of creation.
It's a powerful and symbolic reinterpretation of a very well-known image,
For sure.
which leads us into Chapter 3, aptly titled The Mystery of the Alchemist. Now, when most people hear the word alchemist, they probably picture someone hunched over bubbling beakers in a dusty old lab,
Right.
desperately trying to transmute base metals into gold.
That's the popular image, and Hall acknowledges that,
Right.
a historical pursuit.
Yeah.
However, he argues that the true, deeper purpose of the alchemist went far beyond simply seeking material wealth.
Right.
He suggests that they were actually engaged in a profound spiritual quest, concealing the ancient history of the soul
Right.
and its journey under a veil of chemical symbolism,
Okay.
particularly during periods of intense religious persecution when openly expressing certain spiritual ideas could be very dangerous.
So all those beakers and retorts and strange concoctions were kind of coded language
Yeah.
for spiritual transformation.
That's the core of his interpretation, yes.
Okay.
And he kind of paints this picture, of the solitary alchemist in their hidden laboratory, surrounded by ancient and cryptic texts,
Right.
deeply devoted to unraveling the fundamental mysteries of nature,
Right.
and indeed seeking the elusive philosopher's stone.
Right.
But this quest, according to Hall, was primarily allegorical.
Right.
The real goal wasn't just the literal transmutation of lead into physical gold, using various chemicals and furnaces and burners,
Right.
but rather the discovery of the inner key, which they represented through symbols like sulfur and mercury.
Right.
That would allow them to create the stone and the legendary elixir of life on a much deeper spiritual level
Right.
within themselves.
And he points out this skepticism and ridicule that the world often directed toward the alchemists,
Oh, yeah.
even as they were pursuing what was considered to be utterly impossible. It gives you a sense of the misunderstood visionary
Right.
working in secret.
Exactly. And Hall describes the alchemists' eventual passing, often with their groundbreaking discoveries and profound understandings remaining unacknowledged
Right.
or even scorned in their own time.
Right.
However, he suggests that these truths would gradually gain recognition in later centuries
Right.
as the world slowly began to catch up and grasp the deeper insights they had attained. So it's a powerful testament to the enduring nature of their wisdom.
He then makes this really compelling point, arguing that humanity has been alchemical from the moment we became self-aware,
Right.
drawing parallels, equating our everyday life experiences to the chemicals of life,
Yeah.
the natural world around us, to the great book filled with hidden secrets, our own inner spiritual flame to the lamp that illuminates our understanding and our physical body itself to the alchemical furnace.
Right.
So it's this analogy of life as this continuous process of
Yeah.
inner transformation.
Right.
And he breaks down these key chemicals of this inner spiritual alchemy.
Right.
Salt representing the earthly or physical aspect of our being.
Right.
Sulfur symbolizing the fiery spiritual essence within us. And mercury,
Yeah.
which he interprets as the messenger or the mind.
Right.
With its characteristic purple color representing the blending and interplay between our spirit and our physical body.
For sure.
And the ultimate realization, for the alchemist Hall says, is that they themselves are the philosopher's stone they've been seeking.
Yeah.
And this transformation into something precious like a diamond occurs through the uniting of salt, the body,
Right.
and sulfur, the spirit, through the intermediary of mercury, the mind.
Right.
So it's a very empowering concept of self-realization.
He describes humanity as standing at a crossroads, positioned between the realms of heaven and earth,
Right.
with our higher spiritual nature reaching towards the celestial spheres and our lower self tied to the material world.
Right.
And the Philosopher's Stone in this context becomes the result of harmonizing these two seemingly opposing aspects
Okay.
through the transformative experiences that life brings.
And he goes on to define the elixir of life as being synonymous with the spirit fire itself,
Right.
or perhaps the fuel that sustains it. And this ultimate goal of transmuting base metal into gold is reinterpreted as the transformation of our lower self with all its imperfections into spiritual gold
Okay.
through steady cultivation of love and selfless service to others,
Right.
ultimately leading to this rediscovery of this lost panacea
Right.
for the soul.
For sure.
It's a journey of continuous inner refinement.
And he even acknowledges that some ancient alchemists may have achieved the literal creation of gold from base metals,
Yeah,
based on this esoteric principle that, all things contain elements of everything else within them.
right,
However, I think Hall's primary focus remains on the inner psychological
right.
and spiritual dimensions.
He then introduces the symbol of the five-pointed star, which he notes is significant within Freemasonry as representing the soul itself.
Right.
And he also connects it to the Star of Bethlehem, heralding the birth of the Christ consciousness within.
Right.
And he interprets the image of clasped hands within the star as symbolizing the union of spirit and body, what's often referred to as the marriage of the Lamb, from which this inner Christ is born and awakened.
And this really underscores the inherent potential that resides within each individual for profound spiritual awakening
Right.
and the birthing of a higher level of consciousness.
He reiterates that we don't create something from absolute nothingness,
Yeah.
but rather we work with the inherent potential that exists within us.
Yeah.
And he describes the living philosopher's stone as shining with many different lights,
Right.
reflecting the multifaceted and radiant nature of the human soul.
He then describes this process of inner transmutation,
Right.
where the spiritual fire actively purifies the physical body, resulting in this radiant golden and blue soul body.
It's a striking image
Yeah.
of inner illumination.
And the marriage of the sun and moon, another key alchemical concept.
Right.
He explains is the mystical joining of our heart and mind, the positive and negative poles within us in a state of eternal and harmonious union.
Yeah.
And it's this profound inner integration that allows for the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. And he circles back to the symbol of the five-pointed star with clasped hands, emphasizing that it embodies this very mystery of the unified individual actively working towards mutual betterment.
Right.
With the radiant star representing the fully realized soul body, the living Philosopher's Stone, and the ultimate source of the rivers of life.
Okay.
The dawning of mastery symbolized by the star of the morning.
Hall emphasizes that the alchemy of life itself naturally leads to the progression that the ancient alchemists meticulously described in their texts,
Yeah.
culminating in what they called the Hermetic marriage,
Yeah.
this sacred and balanced union of body and spirit.
For the purpose of mutual growth and development.
Right, and he even suggests that modern individuals living in a time of greater intellectual and spiritual freedom
Right.
are the direct inheritors and
Right.
continuation of the alchemical work of the past.
He highlights the opportunity that the modern seeker has to observe the alchemy of nature all around us on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And to study the principles of divinity, through analogy in our everyday experiences, seeing how life's trials and tribulations serve to temper and refine the spirit.
Right.
He explains how our deepest desires can act as triggers that awaken latent soul powers,
Right.
and how our various life experiences, when reflected upon with developed inner vision, can be transmuted into lasting and enriching soul qualities.
he introduces the imagery of the pillars of the temple, which he interprets as symbolizing the heart and the mind,
Right.
the positive and negative poles that exist within each of us.
Right.
And he stresses this need to consciously pass between these pillars,
Yeah.
to find and maintain a state of inner balance in order to enter the sacred temple of our being,
Right.
requiring an equal and harmonious development of both our emotional and intellectual capacities.
And this really underscores the importance of, equilibrium in our spiritual development,
Right.
avoiding the pitfalls of extremes
Right.
and, actively cultivating that balanced middle path.
Yeah. Hall describes the modern alchemist's journey as one that moves away from a reliance on external guidance toward a place of inner self-reliance where they learn to stand alone.
Right.
In the darkness, guided by their own inner lamp, there awakens spiritual consciousness filled with the elixir of life to navigate the great unknown and ultimately learn the alchemy of divinity directly from the great alchemist itself.